he's got me now. Or does.
Persona 3 is a JRPG that has garnered critical acclaim since its release in 2007. Persona 3 and its re-releases in the form of FES, Portable, and soon Persona 3 Reload have been known for their engaging story, memorable characters, unapologetically 2000s tone, and an outstanding soundtrack. Persona 3 is unique for its fascinating blend of dungeon crawling and social simulation. This set it apart from other games in the genre, and eventually Persona 3 was adapted into a series of animated movies. The Persona 3 movies are a collection of 4 films that adapt the events of the game into a cinematic experience. Each movie explores a different aspect of the game's narrative, from the rise of the main character's powers and the struggle with his own identity, to the ultimate battle against the game's final boss, all while maintaining the attention to detail of the game's stories and themes and a brand new perspective of them as a whole. What makes the movies so special is that they stay true to the spirit of the game while also adding their own unique spin to the story, by giving the silent protagonist of the game his own character. I love Persona 3, FES, or Portable, whichever. I could go hours and hours describing why the Persona video game series means so much to me. This is why, when I heard about the 4 animated movies that adapt each of the main segments of Persona 3's story, I was excited to check them out. But before we get into it, I want to make it clear that not only am I reviewing these as an adaptation, but also as a film itself. This means that even if one adapts the story or events faithfully, I'm going to be looking at other parts of it to properly judge it as a whole. I will also mention that there will be complete spoilers for Persona 3 and each movie in this collection. I encourage you to play the game or watch the movies for yourself before going into this. But if you don't care, let's find out how well these movies do at adapting an 80-hour video game. I think that while in itself it is still a good film, there's no denying that it's just setting everything up. It has excellent character introductions and uses the same killer soundtrack the original had, but even with all of that, it still has the early stage JRPG fluff the original had. But since I knew where it was all going, I understand that that's what needs to be done. I appreciate the effort to characterize the silent protagonist of the game, giving him the name Makoto Yuki. While it may seem like his personality is as flat as Earth, his character slowly goes through serious changes as the movies progress, and by the end of Spring Rebirth, we can see the groundwork of how his character will change as the series progresses. Left emotionally scarred due to the death of his parents 10 years prior, Makoto is cold and apathetic to those around him. His character arc is similar to Chidori from Persona 3, but altered to fit his backstory. Personally, I don't have a problem with it. I found his arc to fit around the personality of the infamous "I don't care" option very well. He pushes everyone away from him and shut himself away from the world to avoid the pain of losing anyone again. As the movie and series progress, we start to see him open himself up. I think the way Makoto was handled was very good, regarding the themes and messages of Persona 3, however it's obviously at its weakest with Spring Rebirth. The slowness at the beginning of the game is put into the first of 4 feature-length movies. So, while it is slow and doesn't have a lot going for it as its own self-contained movie, it is setting everything up to get to the next movies. This means that the film has little to no stakes, barely any character development, and little to no focus on most of the characters. It clearly didn't have the good parts of the story yet, and I found this to taint the film seriously. It follows the introduction of Persona 3 so closely that it never deviates from it, and that makes it feel more like a cutscene compilation than a fully fledged film. I do appreciate the change in how characters were introduced, and Junpei is a lot more tolerable than he is at the beginning of the game, and his jealousy towards Makoto starts to dissipate a lot sooner. They also make Fuka a central character to Makoto, and we get to spend a lot more time with her than at the beginning of the game. In the original Persona 3, she was never a reoccurring character and only appeared when the plot told her to. In Spring Rebirth, he and Fuka run into each other every now and then, and her personality is expanded on more to make her more crucial moments have a greater emotional climax. While I liked the character introductions more, I felt as though Spring Rebirth seriously dropped off once it got to the final third. The animation gets stiff and it feels more turn-based than the original. While the backgrounds and designs are very well detailed, it's clear that there were some moments that the animators had to rush, because the stakes are so astronomically low the final fight doesn't have any tension it wants you to think it has. But watching Makoto's Chad behavior is very fun. A crucial change to this portion is Makoto staying behind instead of joining the group to rescue Fuka. He has a massive moment here where we see his efforts to push the group away fails. He goes back on his decision and decides to fight with them because he doesn't want to lose them like he lost his family. It's small, but it's huge for his character moving forward.
Although I have pointed out some criticisms of this film, there are also many positive aspects to it. The beginning of this film is particularly enjoyable not only because the updated character introductions, as mentioned earlier, but also because the strong opening of Persona 3 translates well into film format. I found most of the storytelling to be engaging and well constructed, with only a slight dip in the final act, where some of the characters lacked emotional development, aside from Fuka and Makoto. I think the filmmakers should have taken creative liberties to flesh out the characters more before the film concluded, since some characters don't get developed in this section of the story like others. Thankfully, once the setup is done, the following movies pick up the pace and take the story in a direction that I found myself enjoying.
Persona 3 the movie number 2, Midsummer Night's Dream, is a massive step up from the previous film from almost every creative standpoint. Midsummer Night's Dream feels like someone with an actual vision came into the writing room and didn't just copy and paste all of a particular segment of the game.
Someone cooked here.
I want to talk about the presentation first, as not only is it much more smooth and more detailed, but incredibly expressive. The direction in the scenes and shots is amazing, and the action is insane. Unlike Spring Rebirth, Midsummer Night's Dream was lucky enough to have some of the great parts of the story. However, it also rushes to adopt the factors that added depth and a heightened factor of the unknown to the methods of the Dark Hour. These factors are Aigis, the Kirijo group itself, and Mitsuru's father, and Strega. With these characters, we learn more about the functions and use of the Dark Hour outside of Seas. While it seems straightforward from the Kirijo group, if anything, it shrouds in more mystery. Not to mention Strega. Who are they associated with, and how do they operate? This moment in the game adds a bigger mystery underneath the surface of the game, and the film does a good but slightly messy job of subtly showing you these mysteries as the story unfolds. Midsummer Night's Dream takes great creative liberty in making the overall story more interesting. The upcoming Persona 3 Reload should take some notes, but we'll get there in a minute. With the introduction of Strega, we see a new threat inside the Dark Hour that dramatically shifts the direction the characters have to take whenever they enter. It adds much needed stakes to the movie, and with the new recruits to Seas, there's an engaging variety to the cast that was needed before. Due to the nature of how the story is presented in the film, the important characters introduced got developed in a much more focused and meaningful way, and they ended up becoming incredibly engaging. While Strega wasn't handled better or worse than the film, their moments with Seas have a lot more weight due to the added depth of Makoto. Finding his smile again, he finds a greater value in life and sees the importance of his allies and getting closer to them. However, he is faced with a dilemma on whether or not he should end the Dark Hour which brought everyone together. His fear of losing his friends starts to affect his view on the Dark Hour in his subconscious. If there's no Dark Hour, what's motivating everyone to stick together? This line of thinking adds to how Makoto would only do things if he was asked to, like fighting in the Dark Hour in the first place. By that line of thinking he's had his whole life, he believes that Seas by extension only sticks together and hangs out because of the Dark Hour. This makes the two teams' rivalries more interesting than in the game, because other than the fact that there's two teams operating within the Dark Hour, there are now legitimate moral questions to be had between them. We see Junpei, Fuka, and Makoto questioning whether or not they're worth much after the Dark Hour is gone, and see that fear of the unknown start to build up between them. One of the most significant improvements to the story of Persona 3 is how Midsummer Night's Dream tells the story between Ken and Shinjiro. They're one of the more compelling storylines of Persona 3 that had the most potential, but the execution of it has mixed reception from fans. Ken's journey to come to terms with his mother's death and his subsequent search for revenge was interesting in the game, but adding his new relationship with Shinjiro and the bond they establish makes it an even more emotional and powerful storyline that the movie explores in more detail. Meanwhile, Shinjiro's tragic past and his relationship with Akihiko are explored more throughout the film, Due to Shinjiro's persona going berserk and out of his control one day, a tragic accident happened that killed Ken's mother. Ever since then, Shinjiro left SEES and made shady deals with Strega to acquire suppressants for his persona. Only until Ken joins do we see Shinjiro come back to keep an eye on him. We see his persona going out of control multiple times, and when Shinjiro's persona has an outburst in front of SEES, we see how destructive it is to everything around it. This moment causes Ken to recognize that Shinjiro's persona is what killed his mother, and Akihiko confronts Shinjiro about the suppressant pills he's taking, which will inevitably kill him. We see the frustrations between Shinjiro, Akihiko, and Ken happen in the game, but it is explored with a heavy focus that the game lacked. Throughout this section of the film's story, we see Shinjiro's desire to protect Ken from making the same mistake he did and make him happy, even though he's responsible for the accidental death of Ken's mom, creating a heart-wrenching dynamic between the two characters. Their connection up to that point where Ken realizes that Shinjiro was the one who killed his mom makes the storyline even more tragic and makes Shinjiro's death much more impactful and emotional than in the game. This serves as a powerful ending, and I'd argue it's handled better here than in the game it's adapting. Overall, Midsummer Night's Dream is a massive step up from the original, with an incredible presentation that greatly boosts important emotional moments from the original and makes my hope for the next movies even greater. My biggest complaint with Rebirth was that it felt very flat after the beginning. Not just the story, but the characters, action, most of the animation, and actual soundtrack, but now everything feels like it got the attention it deserves, and sets up even more to develop as the movie's gone. However, my only complaint about the film's story is how it portrays Junpei and Chidori's storyline and relationship, an incredibly important plot that gets set up at this exact time this film takes place. This game uses summertime to set up a romance between Junpei and Chidori, who, unbeknownst to him, is a member of the enemy Team Strega. What does this film do to mess it up? It doesn't even show it in the first place. It gets a passing mention at best, and normally this would be fine, so long as the next film covers it in more depth. So yeah, Persona 3 the movie Falling Down didn't cover it either. Sticking true to its name, Persona 3 the movie 3 fell down. Falling Down has a change of directors from Tomohisa Taguchi to Keitaro Matanaga. I think Keitaro Matanaga manages to adapt what I would consider the hardest point of the game to adapt well, but albeit rather strangely. The reason that I consider this segment of the game hard to adapt is that there isn't much that happens outside of the melodrama and story events. No major fights other than the beginning and the end. And the new character introduction of Ryuji and the threat of Strega at its all-time high after the death of Shinjiro. I think it's one of the most impactful moments of the game because due to the events that happened before, the hopelessness is loud, and all the characters can do is reflect. Between those moments of actions, there isn't much the player can do. So Falling Down takes this portion of the game and creates a rather melodramatic slice of life that opts to focus more on Makoto and Ryuji. This gives Ryuji the development he never got in the original and develops Makoto's character after the events that have transpired before he must face his final challenge. While that sounds great, I do feel like there are things that I should point out. Without a proper understanding of the game's story or a full playthrough of Persona 3 FES, I feel like there will be some moments that a viewer of these movies will not fully get or understand. One of my main problems with the movie is the beginning. The high-octane action is a strange way to start after the emotional damage from the ending of the previous film. This beginning segment skips over a lot of character development and crucial moments to set up what happens in this segment of the story by skipping directly to the final battle against the last Arcana. It skips over so much story that it almost becomes impossible to understand what happened to set all this up. Not to mention, it skips over the entire setup to Junpei and Chidori's romance, which is one of the center points of the entire film, and Junpei's powerful resolve by the end lacks the way it did before. It's very jarring, even to a fan of the game. I couldn't imagine the confusion a newcomer would have going in. One of the major twists around this time is the betrayal of Ikutsuki. The entire time they were convinced by Ikutsuki that they would be stopping the Dark Hour by defeating each Arcana on a full moon, but unknowingly, they contributed to bringing the world to an end. He reveals that defeating the Arcanas will soon bring about the fall and arrival of Nyx. The film bastardized this twist, mainly because he wasn't written in the plot prevalently enough to make this twist impactful, so When he is about to sacrifice these, you're left incredibly confused by how he got to this point in barely the first 15 minutes. He has this moment to be evil, kills Mitsuru's father, and dies with almost zero impact compared to the game. By far the most significant way this film brushes over the story is the way it handles each character's resolution. Fuka's resolve doesn't really even happen. While Natsuki and Fuka say their goodbyes, the film fails to show a concrete moment of Fuka's growth or transformation. Ken's resolution just doesn't even happen. The previous film presents a pivotal moment with Shinjiro's sacrifice, leading to Ken's subsequent depression and guilt. However, the scene between Akihiko and Ken never happens, so the moment where Ken overcomes his past and forgives Shinjiro never occurs. Akihiko's resolve, arguably the most touching resolution of the game's story, is bastardized in this movie and skipped through during a flashback during the school trip. In his resolution, Akihiko accepted that no matter how strong he is, he'll never fully be able to protect what he cares about. He realized that after the death of his sister, he was too preoccupied with his desire to become stronger when he should live in the moment and cherish the people while he still had them instead. In Falling Down, Akihiko explains the lessons in this resolution to Makoto, which in the context of the scene is actually touching, but directly after there is a hot spring scene where they get caught by the girls, and Akihiko legitimately says, "Am I still unable to protect anyone?" It is literal, unapologetic character assassination here. And Yukari's resolution is also disappointingly rushed. Her discovery of the untampered tape containing her father's heartfelt last words and touching goodbye, which not only proves his innocence, but also provides Yukari with the closure she desperately needed, is shown in a flashback during Mitsuru's resolve. Not only that, but it fails to show her father's goodbye to Yukari, leaving it completely unresolved and the whole point worthless. All these touching resolutions each character had, the ones that let them come to terms with the fact that they might die and that they won't be able to stop Nyx and the fall, but will face it head on because of sheer will, and that if they were going to die, they would look death in the eyes and dare it to kill them. All these touching resolutions when the characters forgive themselves and the people around them are skimmed over to make time for heavy screen time for the hot spring scene and between Makoto and Ryuji. Now, most of these issues I wouldn't even have a problem with if the game didn't do it better. And even with the issues I have with the majority of how Falling Down adapts this segment of the story, I still find that it almost irons itself out with the way it portrays Makoto and Ryuji. I never really liked how Ryuji barely talked to Makoto in the original game, even with the big twist that Ryuji was the appriser that would help bring about the fall.
Ryoji, you're the appriser? And you were inside him?
Pause.
While his character was really only important for this realization and the climax, to me, it wouldn't make sense for them not to be naturally drawn to each other with how they already had a close friendship before his reincarnation. It helps that Makoto gets some fantastic moments where we see his barrier almost completely torn down, to the point where he is open, smiling, laughing, and enjoying life in a way he never really had before. And this is mainly due to Ryoji. So when Ryoji gets confronted by Aigis and he is revealed to be the appriser, it makes for an ending with some pretty heavy emotional weight to it. Mainly following Makoto and Ryuji was a great choice and ended up giving Ryuji a well-developed character, but I don't think they had to sacrifice everything for it. I think that this movie can be used as a reason that these adaptations should have instead been a series like the 26-episode adaptation of Persona 4 and 5. Or at the very least, make Falling Down longer, as not only would it have more time to fully explore its characters and adapt its very complicated plot, but also make time for focus on Ryuji and Makoto, while giving the other characters their resolutions, and plot a much needed focus that could delve into its messages and in the end create a fantastic series that you could watch without playing the original. Persona 3 the movie, Falling Down, had no reason to be the shortest out of the entire series, and while an episodic adaptation could benefit this flaw, a flaw with the series is that changing the director is harder to get away with, and if they started with the director like the director of Rebirth, then the result may not have been as impactful as these previous movies. Overall, the time skips just left me absolutely aghast, flabbergasted. It's shocking that they decided to skip over so much context to set up this movie. and it's going to be confusing to a person who isn't familiar with the story of Persona 3. So I find that the added relationship of Ryuji and Makoto add a lot to Falling Down to make it a strong movie for the most part. It has a lot of problems it didn't have to have. And Falling Down ends up setting up a story that will be very hard to continue. At least to continue the right way. I mean, it would take a miracle to conclude this series properly. Guess what? You'll never believe it. We got a miracle. Now, I went into Persona 3 the movie number 4, Winter Rebirth, hesitantly. After Falling Down, I truly didn't know how they could properly conclude Persona 3's story without making some serious changes. Winter Rebirth ends up taking the most creative liberty in the entire series, but what it creates is something special. Tomohisa Taguchi comes back to adapt the concluding chapter of Persona 3's story, coming back from Midsummer Night's Dream to direct this masterclass conclusion. After all of these movies, I feel like he was the only one who could have done it. It's interesting how he managed to tweak and enhance the storyline to make it more cohesive and satisfying, taking significant creative liberties in the process. On the other hand, the previous team behind Falling Down also exercised similar liberties, but it ended up backfiring terribly. This comes from the team's lack of understanding of what made these relationships so special, and focusing more on what would have been a side plot normally. This inability to balance these two factors of the story alongside a multitude of pacing issues made Falling Down incredibly messy compared to the previous films, but Winter Rebirth doesn't have the same issue at all. I'd argue Winter Rebirth perfectly adapted not just the ending, but Persona 3 and its meaning, which is death and overcoming it. The feelings this movie gave me throughout its whole runtime caught me completely off guard. Not only did it capture the powerful and intricate emotions of the game, but expanded perfectly on what it set up through the previous movies and executed the emotional impact of the ending perfectly. The story of the movie starts directly after Ryoji defeats Aigis and is revealed as the Appriser of Death. His arrival signifies that the end of all living things is near and that this fate is unstoppable. However, because of the bond between Makoto and his other identity, Pharos, Ryoji offers Seize a choice. If Makoto takes Ryoji's life, all memories of the Dark Hour would disappear and they can live unaware of their fate, or they can spare him and give a futile attempt to face Nyx. He gives them until the end of the month to decide what they really want, and during this month, we see something new compared to the game. We see these characters in a state we haven't before. Unlike other fights they've had, Nyx is death itself, and you can't beat death. For the first time in the entire film series, it doesn't just feel like a highlight reel of the story, it feels fine-tuned and translated specifically for a cinematic experience. Each character regresses as they struggle with the realization of their inevitable deaths, especially Yukari, whose fear of her death takes such a toll on her that her persona goes berserk and almost kills her. Never in the game or movies have we seen a character who once had a stable persona without pills have their persona go berserk. We see similar reactions within the rest of the cast as well, with Junpei getting into fights to feel something and taking his frustration out on Seize, Akihiko and Mitsuru feeling the need to gloss over it and ignore it to not go insane, Ken shutting himself off from everyone, and Fuka only being able to do so much as watch the chaos. And Makoto, who seems to have lost all sense of concern and motivation, has completely regressed back to the first movie. Each character gets the resolutions that we never got to see in Falling Down. The main goal of the resolutions in the original Persona 3 was to overcome their fear of fighting Nyx. Since the cast of Persona 3 had very little knowledge about Nyx and the Fall, most of their resolutions were pretty meaningless. I also find it funny how the main conflict established in this part of the game is established at the end of the movie. So it literally renders every single character's resolution meaningless because they don't even need it yet. It's a mess. It's serious. Like, this is completely off script. It's a mess. My first time watching it, I actually liked it a lot, and then I rewatched it and I was like, oh my god, this makes no sense. So yeah, take that as you will. In Winter Rebirth, they come to these conclusions on their own. We see as they are brought to their absolute lowest, broken and beaten down, to then learn from everything they've gone through and use that to rebuild themselves from the ground up. It feels perfectly paced and natural, and we see them come to terms with the unstoppable fate coming before them, yet facing it anyway out of sheer will. But for Makoto, it's different. We see him back as the person he was in the beginning, a shell. His wall has been rebuilt, and he is lost. Since he is ultimately the one who has to choose whether or not he'll kill or spare Ryoji, we see a significant impact on his state of mind. After a heart-to-heart with Junpei, who tells him that no matter what he chooses, he won't hate him, Makoto goes to the construction site of the destroyed bridge from the beginning of the film. He genuinely starts to consider killing Ryoji. We see how the days they'd live in ignorance would go, but we see that reality slowly start to crumble before his eyes, and we find ourselves back at the bridge with Makoto. Only when he joins Elizabeth to explore around Iwatodai does he realize what the whole year he spent there has given him. It has given him people to fight for, and because of that, he was able to finally start living. Something he hasn't been able to do for years. With this, he manages to come one step further in finding the answer to life, which can give him the miracle to defeat Nyx. In the end, they choose to confront Nyx, despite the odds against them. A notable aspect of this film is the increased focus on Aigis, who was given little attention in previous installments such as Midsummer Night's Dream and Falling Down. Winter of Rebirth finally allows her to shine. After being defeated by Ryoji and repaired by the Kirijo group, Aigis begins to develop genuine human emotions. She cares deeply for her teammates and Makoto and decides the best course of action for Seize is to kill Ryoji rather than face Nyx. She fears for their safety and wants them to live happily without worrying about the fall. However, when Ryoji emerges from Makoto's room unscathed, Aigis panics and attempts to kill him herself. When this fails, and Ryoji leaves at midnight, Aigis flees. Eventually, Makoto finds her at the school rooftop. At this point, Aigis has become more human than robot, but still sees herself as a broken tool, unable to fulfill her purpose by defeating Ryoji. She struggles to understand her newfound emotions and their significance. However, spending time with Seize has helped her develop relationships and emotions. She is now a robot with a soul, pondering the meaning of her existence and relationship. On the rooftop, Makoto helps her discover her reason for fighting. Him. When the rest of Seize joins them, they all agree to confront Nyx head-on. There is one issue that arises from defeating Nyx and ending the Dark Hour. The memories of these events will fade away. To ensure they never forget, they promise to meet again on graduation day at the rooftop when the cherry blossoms bloom. All these resolutions culminate into a perfect final act. The final battle between Makoto and Nyx for everyone's souls is absolutely stellar. Makoto switching between multiple ultimate personas, Nyx saying all of its quotes from the game, and then Thanatos going absolutely berserk on Nyx in the sky was exhilarating. While some people may have found the solo battle between Makoto and Nyx disappointing, I felt like it made the story more compelling, especially with the development of the two characters throughout the tetralogy. During the battle, each member of Seize fought against Strega in the shadows below. While it seems strange for the second awakenings of Seize's persona to occur in the final battle, just for the sake of hype, I don't really care. As for Strega, they got ignored after the church scene, but they were left behind way earlier in the game, so it's not even a big issue. In the end, Makoto summons Messiah and utters his mother's final words to Aigis, live. The moment when Makoto deals the final blow to Nyx and uses his miracle to save the world is really impactful and just awesome. At the end of this film, we see a cast of characters fully realized and resolute. Makoto's journey as a character throughout the entire series was absolutely phenomenal, and seeing his journey come to an end as he sacrifices his soul to seal Nyx and save the lives of everyone is just as soul-crushing as the game. I'm glad they left the ending untouched. In the game, people said that Makoto's death was left too vague, and while I disagree, seeing how hard Makoto struggles to continue living to see the cherry blossoms grow as he gets noticeably weaker makes it much more clear that these are his final moments. I don't think an ending to a video game or a movie has touched me the way Persona 3 has, and Winter of Rebirth with its fantastic presentation, direction, and passion managed to push my emotions even further than any of the films before it, and sometimes even rivaled the game in my eyes.
That's not to undermine the game at all, but Winter of Rebirth was crafted so incredibly well due to the nature of it being a film that can expand on Makoto as a character in a way the game simply couldn't. Not only will Winter of Rebirth stand the test of time as one of the greatest video game film adaptations, but is also by its own means a phenomenal film. In conclusion, what a ride! The Persona 3 The Movie Collection is absurdly inconsistent, yet incredibly fun. I'm not saying that I didn't enjoy my time with these, quite the opposite. The Persona 3 Movie Collection, especially the final film,
Someone cooked here.
might just be the best video game film adaptation I've ever seen. Even despite the inconsistency in the direction, the Persona 3 Movie Collection still manages to be a solid adaptation of the video game. But that's all I have to say about it. Bye.